So I'm ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very grateful to the Institute for inviting me to speak here today. The subject is going to be the European Supergrid. I'm well aware of the work that's being done by the Institute in the areas of energy and climate change, and I wish to commend your recent report on climate change challenge, in which the role of renewable energy featured so prominently as a solution. In these circumstances, I was delighted to receive the invitation from the Energy Group, led by my very dear old friend Liam Kennellan, to speak about the Supergrid, because of the relationship between renewable energy and the challenge of eliminating 80% of carbon emissions by 2050. So let me begin by telling you what I'm not going to be talking about. I will not recite the science of climate change. I take it as a given that we humans have to contain the rise in global temperatures to less than 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. Otherwise, we will have triggered, and possibly may already have done so, irreversible and catastrophic damage to the planet. I assume that nobody here is a disciple of President Václav Klaus. Neither will I recall the arguments underlying the concept of peak oil. My friend Colin Campbell, now happily ensconced in Ballydehob, has well established that the production of oil will peak and then begin to taper off. The 5 majors peaked in 2005, and last year the production from the 5 energy majors was 615,000 barrels a day, down on what it had been in 2005. Instead, I'm going to take it as an absolute imperative that by 2050 we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80%, at a time when the generation of electricity is expected to increase by 100%. The first figure of the 80% greenhouse gas reductions comes from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The second figure of 100% increase in power generation comes from the International Energy Agency, which is part of the OECD, set up by Henry Kissinger in 1973. So the challenge: an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions while power generation is being doubled is some challenge, Mr. Chairman. We can only meet the challenge by replacing hydrocarbons with renewable energy, and the logic of that is inescapable. To pursue this logic to its ultimate, the only form of renewable energy which is capable of commercial deployment on the scale and at the speed we need is actually wind. More particularly, the only form of renewable energy that will do the job in Europe is actually offshore wind. And for that to happen, we need a supergrid. And that's what we're going to talk about. So the potential of wind. Let me start by talking of wind itself. And let me begin by stating the obvious, because the problem with policy making is that the obvious is too often ignored. And it's usually the case in this country. Wind is a source of energy. It's infinitely renewable. It's clean. Above all, it's a free source of fuel. And lest we forget, it's ours. It's not owned by President Putin, for instance, or any of the other people we wouldn't want to be associated with. In short, it meets all the criteria set by Irish and European policymakers as a solution to the twin challenges of climate change and energy security. Like any natural resource, it's concentrated in various locations throughout the planet. And like any other source of energy, it has first to be harnessed and then transformed into power. Europe, as it happens, is endowed with the best wind resource in the world. Well, there's actually many good sources of wind in the world, but Europe, and particularly its offshore regions, is very good, just by virtue of our geography, where we sit on the surface of the globe. For this reason, wind has now become the fuel of choice in Europe and has become a mainstream rather than a marginal source of electricity. When we set Airtricity up in 1997, it was regarded as an esoteric, marginal part of any kind of system that might, if it really got lucky, contribute 5% to electricity demand. Last year, for instance, more wind energy capacity was installed in Europe than any other form of conventional or renewable generation. Wind power generation capacity is forecast to grow from 74,000 megawatts at present to 218,000 megawatts by 2020, or a crude average increase of 12,000 megawatts per year. This is going to be bigger than gas, coal, nuclear, and maybe all of them put together. Some may think that is impossibly optimistic, but just let me point out that last year China installed 12 gigawatts in almost their first their first attempt at building wind power. And that the rate of installation, like everything else in China, is doubling each year. They can do things there that we can only dream about. However, I think we're probably happy enough living here. India installed 10 gigawatts and is growing fast. So Europe is not out of line in its stated renewable energy targets. If anything, they may be too modest. The problem for Europe is that its potential to develop onshore wind is limited both by space and by planning constraints, really by pressure of population in the areas where the wind exists. The great bulk of the 2050 target will have to come from offshore wind. And for that to happen, we need a supergrid. So a little bit about the background. How the idea for the supergrid, the European supergrid, evolved. It began life as a concept in my mind some 8 years ago. It emerged from a number of propositions, each of which is simple in itself, but when combined with the others, adds up to a dramatic vision for an energy future that we could create in Europe. I started with the attraction of wind as a source of power. As I said earlier, it's abundant at these latitudes, especially in the seas around this island and northwestern Europe. It's a free fuel, it's clean, and because it's indigenous, it can provide the answer to energy security. 8 years ago, I thought all this was obvious. But for power engineers, wind had the apparent drawback that it wasn't always available in a given spot at a given time. And this is true, a phenomenon that caused me to think about the very nature of wind and whether it was suitable to provide a mainstream solution. That led me to address the correlation between wind and weather. The obvious conclusion was that the availability of wind is a function of atmospheric pressure. As weather patterns move, the wind moves with them. I reflected on the fact that while wind may blow intermittently at any given point, it's always blowing somewhere on this continent of ours. In short, as a continental resource, it's permanent and it's predictable. The research for this came out of the University of Kassel, which I was lucky enough to come across in 2001. And they showed that if the grid is 1,500 kilometres long, both ends are independent of one another, not correlated, and therefore you get a very big smoothing out of wind. And it occurred to me that if we could construct wind farms in the seas around Europe and join them together with one interconnected system, then we would always have access to wind power, and the problem of intermittency or variability would be solved. So the key to turning wind into a dependable source of power lay in creating a grid that stretched from the Baltic through into the North Sea and then out into the Atlantic. Collecting the electricity generated, bringing it ashore, and finally delivering it into the various national markets throughout Europe. The missing piece of the jigsaw was transmitting the electricity from sea to shore. That's why I began the search for a technology which would transmit electricity without losses over long distances and, in effect, revolutionise interconnection. When I found the answer in high-voltage direct current HVDC, as it is now known, the picture was complete, and we brought the pieces of the jigsaw together in what we christened at the time the supergrid. Because of the sheer size of the proposed grid, stretching some thousands of kilometres across the northern coast of Europe, and because the technologies to be used were still unproven, the only way to convince people of its viability was to build a demonstration project. For that reason, I proposed we begin with a 10,000 megawatt project in the North Sea, connecting wind power generation in British, German and Dutch waters and simultaneously supplying each of these markets with the electricity generated at sea. Many thought this was an implausible idea, but I'm happy to say that it got immediate support from the then UK Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who I met personally, and continues to receive the support, I might say, enthusiastic, overwhelming, and joined-up government support of the British government. It's awesome to see government, actually, when it's joined up. It's the only place I've ever seen. I didn't live through the Second World War, so I never saw joined-up government at work. But right now in Britain, we're seeing an absolute transformation in thinking and the alignment of government departments. It's an awesome sight. Commissioner Peebles, who has often spoken here, was also an early supporter, and in almost all major speeches he gives on Europe now, he talks about large-scale offshore wind, and he constantly talks and refers to the supergrid. And the Commission progressively advanced towards the position whereby offshore wind became the centrepiece of its renewable policy. At the same time, the UK, German and Dutch governments committed themselves to major offshore targets for 2020. The UK alone intends, it's given out licences for 50,000 megawatts, or it will have by the end of the year, 50,000 megawatts for people to get planning permission offshore. And I reckon that they'll probably build nearly 30,000 megawatts of that in the North Sea. And actually, most of the North Sea and maybe 2,000 megawatts in the Irish Sea, or maybe a little more opposite Dublin here. In practice, the need for a demonstration project has been superseded by the policy decisions of the Commission and the governments of the EU, Germany and the Netherlands. The foundations for the supergrid are being laid. In effect, the European Supergrid has moved from being a concept to a concrete project, and I'd be delighted to talk to you at the end about where I'm on a stage here on my way to Europe to talk about the setting up of a group called the Friends of the Supergrid, which I will tell you about later on if you're interested and still awake. A little bit about the importance of scale. If offshore wind is to be a technical and commercial success, then scale becomes critical. The average wind farm size on land is about, some 20 to perhaps, if you're lucky, maybe 100 megawatts. If you're in Texas, maybe 1,000, but there's very few Texas around. But offshore, we can actually achieve economies of scale by going for much bigger units of production. That's why, for example, I no longer speak of wind farms when talking about the future of offshore wind or of the supergrid. I only talk of wind-fired power stations, each of which has a standard size of 500 megawatts. They are the modules on which the supergrid will be built. So in thinking of the supergrid, think of clusters of 500 megawatts of wind power. That would be 20 times bigger than the wind farm I built in Arklow Banks, to this day Ireland's only offshore wind project. Then there are economies of scale resulting from larger turbines. Turbine size has grown over the past 2 decades from the first one that we built in Ireland, which was 0.25 of a megawatt in Bellacork in 1992, to a current size of 3 to 5 megawatts. In the medium term, they'll be replaced by 6 to 7.5 megawatt machines. The expectation is that these in turn will be supplanted by a 10 megawatt unit, a giant of a turbine whose wingspan is 160 metres, and will be the equivalent of an office block of 33 stories high. When mounted on its tower, the tip of the turbine blade could reach as high as a 40-storey building. These are the turbines of the future on which the supergrid will be based. So a little bit about the HVDC network. Scale will be truly realised because of the technological breakthrough, which has revolutionised our ability to link the generation and consumption of electricity, irrespective of distance and without the power losses that are inherent in any AC transmission system. This sounds a bit engineering-wise. So I'll persist and I'll make it simple if I think it's really getting out of hand here. The full significance of a switchable HVDC innovation has not yet been appreciated by policymakers or by the business community. It's clear that a network incorporating a HVDC grid with the redundancy and reliability of the ubiquitous AC grids is now a reality. The limits of what is technologically possible have been greatly expanded. It's a breakthrough in technology which will do for the energy sector what the coming of passenger railways did in the 19th century trade. It will eliminate the problem of transporting over long distance at speed and at affordable cost. Simply put, a DC grid, the losses in a DC grid are proportional only to the cross-sectional area, where the losses in an AC grid, the stuff that does all the lighting here and everything else, they're proportional to length. So basically, above 75 kilometres, it pays to construct a grid out of DC. I've given you, a little bit on the supergrid up to now, but I'd like to actually define it so as to get to a deeper understanding of what's involved. When, for example, we combine the 500 megawatts power station with advances in turbine technology and include transmission by HVDC, then we can define the supergrid as follows. It's an electricity transmission system, mainly based on direct current, designed to facilitate large-scale sustainable power generation in remote areas for transmissions to centres of consumption, one of whose fundamental attributes will be the enhancement of the market in electricity. I think that definition says it all, but I'm only too aware of the problems that are still to be solved, both technical and political. Here's an example of what has to be done technically. For a grid stretching across tens of thousands of square kilometres of ocean, we will have to introduce what we in Mainstream Renewable Power have termed the supernode. While the underpinning science has to be developed, we are quite clear about the concept and about the design parameters that will underpin the supernode. It's a junction on the supergrid, which actually acts like a router in your IT systems. It will be both a collector and a distributor of large-scale electrical energy. In our context, it is based on collecting the power at AC and transforming that AC then into DC technologies by DC technological means, using the individual strengths to its own advantage. I mean, AC is actually easier to manipulate. It's easier to break it. It's easier to do things with it. But DC is far cheaper to transport. And basically, what we do is we put the two of those together to give ourselves an electricity system that will give us energy independence. We use the AC to collect the energy from the offshore wind power stations and the DC to transmit this energy to distant load centres. We then convert back to AC for connection to existing grid transmission and distribution systems. We propose to do this using many supernodes connected in the DC supergrid to allow multi-directional power flows depending on supply and demand. On the technical side, our proposed supernode design can be refined and enhanced by developments of the HVDC circuit breaker. This is something, by the way, that doesn't exist as we speak. The HVDC circuit breaker, but having had extensive meetings with ABB and Siemens, they both have designs for it. It's actually not technically difficult to do. It's just that nobody ever wanted to interrupt large DC currents before, and we're going to have to do so if we want to move electricity around with the same reliability and efficiency as we do with its AC relation. One of the engineering tasks ahead is to create an interface between the offshore supergrid and the established grids on land. This means that there must be systematic interaction between what we've termed the offshore transmission system operator and the onshore TSOs, and this is one of the political issues that has to be solved. It also means that the EU should have common regulatory system across Europe. Now, you'll all be aware that getting any common regulatory system anywhere in Europe about anything, or indeed anywhere in the world, is always fraught with difficulties. But we intend to make this happen by involving all the direct parties in the quest. Let's talk a little bit about the subject of governance. One of the benefits of the supergrid is that it will enhance the market for electricity, as I set out earlier in its definition. It will be possible to route power from jurisdiction to jurisdiction using the supergrid as a common resource, thereby providing a most elegant solution to the market fragmentation that bedevils Europe at present, penalises the customer by imposing monopoly prices, and weakens business competitiveness by increasing the cost base. 95% of all power produced in Europe is actually consumed in the country in which it's produced. And there's no infrastructure to take an awful lot of power from one country to the other. And even if the infrastructure did exist, there are various country codes and various restrictions on trade which exist now, not quite as badly as they did before the EU was founded. But the last bastion of monopoly power actually is the electricity industry. Again, I'd welcome questions about that later on, because we're making great progress on that, as indeed our own regulatory system has shown over the last few years. This leads logically to the question of the appropriate governance system for this common piece of infrastructure. And here I invite the Institute to help me refine the ideas we have so far developed on using the treaties to create a functioning single market in electricity. The long-held objective of the single market for electricity can be created by the supergrid, in which the customer is king and where risks are shouldered by investors, not by the unfortunate consumer as at present. The most basic requirement is for an offshore transmission system operator to regulate the supergrid in the common interests of the participating investors and to share out the benefits equitably among the participating member states. That will get the show started, and we need to think all this out over the next 5 years. In fact, I see us ramping up to the supergrid proper over a period between now and 2020. And again, we'd like to talk about that later on, but I'm going to try and cover everything here. By using the enhanced cooperation provisions of the treaties, the European offshore transmission system operator can be based on European law and be made an integral part of the EU system of economic governance, analogous to the EIB or the ECB itself. In fact, we see the offshore policy coordinator as having a role here in that, and we're delighted, of course, that the Lisbon Treaty is passed. It means we don't have to spend a lot more money and a lot more time next year going through a third rerun. But it was an absolute delight to see it happen. Boy, where would Ireland be without Europe? Huh? You know, I visited a lot of other countries recently to take the idea of wind there, and I can see how the power of Europe really works in favour of innovation. Of these clusters of innovation that actually are so necessary to bring new technologies to stream. And we in Europe are number one in the world at this. And some other countries are a bit isolated, and that's a great pity. I think an association with Europe for those other countries would be greatly welcomed by both. If 7%, by the way, if we're talking about who pays for all this vast amount of money that's going to be spent on the supergrid, you have to actually encourage people to build the supergrid offshore. If 7% is the regulated rate of return for building grids onshore, well, the additional risks of building offshore should attract a rate of return of something in the order of 10%. I don't at all underestimate the political challenge of getting national governments to think of offshore wind as a continental resource which needs to be exploited for the common good. But at least we're going to start talking in terms of wind as a continental resource as distinct from as a country, or in the case of the United States, as a state resource. I'm only too conscious of the fact that electricity markets are the last remaining bastions of protectionism and monopoly power. A single market in electricity and gas is the one remaining piece of 1992 project yet to be completed. But I'm also conscious of Monet's belief that crisis, if properly exploited, unlocks progress. We are confronting two crises, those of climate change and energy security, and that is why I believe the political will can be generated to build the governance system I've just outlined, because there's no answer to these crises except to develop renewables on the kind of scale that we're talking about. The economic challenge. If this is the case, then let me outline the scale of the solution, what it will cost. I will start with the forecast that the European economy will continue to grow over the decades ahead, despite the current economic depression. Furthermore, demand for electricity will increase progressively, not just as a consequence of this economic growth, but more fundamentally because of the transformation within the economy itself. Electricity is set to become the dominant source of energy. As fossils fade out, we are indeed heading into what we might term the electricity economy. Taking these two factors into account and even allowing for huge improvements in energy efficiency, the anticipated growth in electricity demand will be between 2 and 3% out to 2050. At an average growth rate of 2%, demand will double by 2050. At 3%, the demand will actually more than treble. But as we said at the outset, carbon emissions have to be reduced while generation is increasing, which means that all existing coal, oil and gas generation will be progressively phased out. After 2030, and this isn't my estimate, I'm happy to report, it's Shell's, no more fossil-fired plant will be built. Fossil fuel production will have disappeared by 2050 and will have been replaced by mainly renewables, but there'll be some nuclear in the equation. By 2050, the generation mix will look something like 50% from wind, 30% from solar, 10% from new renewables, which are not yet commercial, and 10% from nuclear. Growth rates of 2 or 3% in electricity demand allow us to put upper and lower limits on the new generation capacity needed by 2050. A simple extrapolation of current generation capacity at these rates, and with an average capacity factor of 35%, indicate that Europe will need to install somewhere between 1.2 million and 1.5 million megawatts of wind by 2050. And even the most optimistic forecast for onshore, which is about 200,000 megawatts, mean we have to build something between 1 and 1.5 million megawatts of wind offshore by 2050 to make ourselves energy independent and to deal with the environmental imperative. So, at an average cost of 3 million per megawatt installed, and there will be a total investment of between 3 and 4.8 trillion euros. Now, by the way, that's not really all that big, even if you're going to do it out of fossils, actually, because all the current plant will have been used up by that stage. And we are going to spend that on electricity generating plant in any case by 2050. It's just that now we're going to do it exclusively almost in renewables. This is a gigantic investment, and what excites me as a businessman is that we can anticipate getting a big share of that market. And the way to get the share of that market is to be involved in thinking out the future and presenting policy options, and then gathering together all the technological providers, corralling them, and then getting agreement to common technical standards, and then go ahead and build it in Europe. And then we can roll it out throughout the rest of the world. I've outlined in many previous speeches the engineering and employment opportunities presented by this vast undertaking, and let me repeat them here in brief. Europe will have to construct new ports, design and build flotillas of special purpose vessels. Actually, we think 6 new types of vessels will have to be designed. Train tens of thousands of technicians and technologists. Manufacture the turbines, the towers and components. Make and lay the cables that will interconnect the power stations. Install control systems based on advanced IT, and finally work out the financial, legal and other support schemes that will be needed to make the whole thing possible. Europe has hardly begun, but already some governments have seen the opportunities ahead, especially, as I said, the UK, who's the global leader in terms of ambition and in terms of action. Because of that, we in Mainstream Renewable Power are happy to partner with the UK government in many ways. We have, for example, undertaken to create a centre of excellence in training apprentices in Northumberland on the North Sea coast. That's beside where we think the new port to service a lot of this will be done. We hope to invest heavily, and we are already in the process of constructing a 420 megawatt project off the Scottish coast, a project appropriately called Neart na Gaoithe. It's English guys who thought this up. I'm amazed. Let me talk a little bit about Ireland. You're all probably feeling great now. It's time to bring the show back down to some dreadful reality. I regret to say that we have no such plans at all for Ireland. Here in Ireland, there's no vision for the future. Led for so long by Bertie Ahern, who said, "I don't do the vision thing. I have no vision for the future. I will continue doing what I'm doing. And what's more, I've stayed in power longer than anybody with a vision." Direct quote from the great man. No vision for the future, hence no plan to develop offshore wind as a national resource, and no understanding of its potential for exports or for employment, or for to be able to attract foreign direct investment into these shores. Now, this saddens me deeply, but only for a few minutes. The rest of the world wants to do it, so we're happy to oblige. I cannot understand why institutional inertia should be allowed to overcome entrepreneurship at a time of crisis when we need both hope and action. Along with Scotland, Ireland has the best wind resources in Europe. But unlike Scotland, Ireland has no real idea of how to go about developing them. Scotland wants to be the Saudi Arabia of wind. I've actually met with Alex Salmond on many occasions, and the thing that really excites him is the Supergrid. He says, "Are you the guy who really thought this up?" I said, "Yeah, well, come and see me and tell me what I can do to help you get this thing through." That's the kind of attitude you get from the leader of the Scottish Nationalists, who is the current First Minister in Scotland. It is investing 10 times more resources than we are in working out policy and implementing it with expedition. Ireland is not at the races, and there's no indication that it ever will be anytime soon. Ireland is not, for instance, actively involved in the Commission's planning for the first elements of the supergrid, although Norway is. While not yet in the EU, it wants to be the battery for Europe. You can imagine how the supergrid linked up with Norway can compensate for local variations before we get the full supergrid built out, for local variations in wind. So, this is wind, dammable hydro and wind work fairly brilliantly together. Its ambition is no less bold than Scotland's and stands as a reproach and as an indictment of Irish inertia. So let me conclude on an optimistic note. As an entrepreneur, you have to be optimistic by nature. The European Supergrid is now accepted by policymakers and by most maritime states as the way forward in harnessing renewables in the fight against climate change and achieving energy security. Ambitious plans are in place to invest in offshore wind. By 2020, Europe will have reached the critical mass in terms of megawatts installed at sea, and supporting infrastructure will be well advanced. I think we'll be building from 2020 onwards something like 40,000 megawatts a year until 2050. Thought has been given at last to the governance of a continental resource with the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty, and that will provide us with a legal base for creating new common institutions. Greening the economy is now well understood as an economic stimulus package. We need to restore confidence and revive growth. The forthcoming IPCC conference on climate change in Copenhagen will sharpen global ambition to reduce carbon emissions. Unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be any agreement there. I can't see America and India being able to actually deliver on such a treaty to replace Kyoto. But I think there will be a political statement. The science is inexorable. It doesn't matter what people do or don't do. If we don't do something soon, as Stern pointed out, our goose will be cooked. Europe will continue as a global leader in the fight against climate change and the leading realist in making the right choices. Central among those choices will be the decision to exploit offshore wind. As a matter of fact, we probably don't have a lot of alternatives. And the primary resource that's going to be needed to make that happen is, without any question, the European Supergrid. Thank you for your attention.